Welcome to this Baptist News Global webinar. Here's your host, Mark Wingfield.
Well, it is my pleasure to welcome to our change-making conversation my friend Amanda Tyler, who is sitting in Washington, D.C. today because she's just finished a couple of days of BJC board meetings. And she has a new book, as you know, if you're on this webinar, that's coming out in just about a week and a half, 2 weeks. We were just talking, it's so popular, it's already in a second printing, and it's not even been published yet. That's a great sign, right? Really good sign. And the book is called How to End Christian Nationalism. And we're going to talk about all of this. I told Amanda just a moment ago, the thing that I think sets this book apart is that it's not just diagnosing that there is a problem, it is prescribing some solutions to the problem. There are plenty of ways and plenty of other writers who are saying, look, that's Christian nationalism, but this book I think is different in that it gives us something to do in response to that. And so that's where we want to begin. But we're going to back up before we get there. And Amanda, your bio, if anyone wants to go read that, they can see the whole story of how you ended up in the position you're in, and well suited for that. You know, just really everything lined up so well in your career and your life to prepare you for the work you're doing now. But in addition to leading BJC, you created this thing called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And I think the polling would tell us you were ahead of the curve on people even knowing what that word meant, right? How did you come up with this idea? What prompted this?
Yeah, well, it's so good to be with you, Mark, and to be with this community, Baptist News Global. So yes, I came to BJC as executive director in 2017, January 2017, 2 weeks before Trump was inaugurated to the presidency. And I point that out because his first administration really changed the course and I think upped the stakes of what's at stake for religious freedom for all in this country in many harmful ways. And some of that was, right after he was inaugurated, the Muslim ban and that, attack on religious freedom for all people. And then later that summer was, of course, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. And then soon after that, tragically was the shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue. And I kind of say these different points in time that really coincided with the first couple of years of my leadership of BJC really revealed that we had a growing problem in our country around Christian nationalism. This very old ideology that has a relatively new language put around it, and started to kind of read in some of the scholarly literature about the kind of public polling around Christian nationalism as a phenomenon, and really thinking that that language helped explain what was happening with these threats to religious freedom, and particularly how they were becoming more deadly. And so it were those events that really led to BJC's leadership of the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, which formally launched in July of 2019. So you're right. When we first launched, the words Christian nationalism were not as much a part of the lexicon, as part of common conversation, as they are now. I think for a lot of people, the events of January 6, 2021 was maybe when they first really started putting language to this problem. But you're right that in many ways we were ahead of that curve, but it's because of the longstanding work of Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, the work that we've been doing for decades of really helping to understand religious freedom, what's at stake, the importance of separation of church and state to maintaining it, and recognizing this mythology of a Christian nation, this ideology of Christian nationalism, was a clear and present danger to religious freedom for all people.
So you didn't coin the term, but
No.
You certainly have introduced it and helped expand the acceptance of it. And you mentioned something just a moment ago. I'm curious, why was there a need to do something apart from BJC and not just make this part of BJC's folded into your mission? You created a new organization.
Well, not a new organization, but a new campaign, right? So the campaign or the movement of Christians against Christian nationalism, a separate website, certainly.
Okay.
But it was meant to be a grassroots, bottom up, kind of digital campaign of anyone who identified as Christian, who wanted to take a public stand against Christian nationalism. We wanted to both raise awareness around the problem, give people some vocabulary and some understanding about what was happening, but also to help identify people in communities all across the country from all different expressions of Christianity who wanted to unite across lines of difference to do something about it. And in many ways, that means it was very much in the mold of the kind of work that BJC has been doing for decades, right? We've been bringing together both within the Baptist movement, bringing together different kinds of Baptists to work together for religious freedom, but then also in Washington in public policy circles, working in ecumenical interfaith and with secular and civil rights groups united to protect the separation of church and state. So this way of doing things in coalition or with different groups was really something very natural for us.
Right.
But this was the first, and honestly, it wasn't the first time. We had done kind of a sign-on statement or a similar work when I first came on to oppose attacks on the Johnson Amendment.
Yes.
Yeah. So we had kind of worked with some of these same groups, again, some more secular allies too in that work, but to have kind of a sign-on statement to protect the independence and the independence from partisan campaigning of the nonprofit sector and particularly houses of worship. And so in some ways we were thinking, well, that's the kind of model that we want to apply here. What of course is different about this campaign is that over the last 5 years, we've just seen more and more the growth of Christian nationalism and also the attacks on religious freedom. And so this campaign has very much morphed in a lot of ways, including leading to the writing of this book.
So, there's a well-documented thing called confirmation bias that, you buy a red sports car and all of a sudden you see red sports cars everywhere on the road. Is it possible that the incidence of Christian nationalism hasn't really been increasing so much, but we've been more aware of it? Or is it really increasing, or is it both?
I think both is probably the right way to look at it. I think now that we have some language to explain what we're seeing, it's more easy to identify when we see Christian nationalism. At the same time, and this is a whole conversation actually about, is Christian nationalism really on the rise? If you look at polling around the issue, we actually are seeing, I think, some very encouraging movement that more and more people are, once they understand what Christian nationalism is and have some language around it, they're actually rejecting Christian nationalism. That we've seen changes in polls over even the last few years, that fewer people are full-on ambassadors of Christian nationalism, to use the language of some of the pollsters, Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead. And that's great news. Here's why it doesn't feel that way, is that in addition to Christian nationalism being this political ideology and cultural framework that tries to merge American Christian identities, Christian nationalism is also a well-funded and highly organized political movement.
Yes.
And that movement is gaining steam and has been gaining steam over the last several years. And there's been a very alarming shift of a normalization of Christian nationalism, that some leaders like Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance, are actually embracing the term of being a Christian nationalist. They're making bigger power plays to actually push Christian nationalism in the public schools and in government, in rhetoric, in ways that we hadn't seen for several decades. And so I think we see, of course, the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, who in many ways shows signs of Christian nationalism in the way that he approaches his position of power. Members of the U.S. Supreme Court, like Justice Alito, flying a flag, or maybe it was his wife flying the flag, but at his house, that is associated with Christian nationalism. So I think what is different about now, and where it isn't just confirmation bias, but actually an alarming shift, is that we have more and more people who are embracing Christian nationalism, who are in power and are using their positions of power to move towards an authoritarian theocracy and away from a pluralistic democracy. And again, we see that at the same time that we see rising instances of political violence. We see an attack on free and fair elections in the form of January 6th. And we have real concerns about what might happen in this election year. So I think all of this together shows that this is one of those, I like to put it as a high tide of Christian nationalism.
Okay.
Not the first time in American history we've seen it. You know, we saw it in the 1950s, we saw it in the early 20th century, 1910s, 1920s, saw it in the Civil War. There were other times where we had some of these high tides of Christian nationalism, but I think we are certainly at one of those points right now.
So before we get on to the next question that's related to that, I've heard several of the research firms, PRI, Pew, Gallup, and their representatives talk about you can't just go out and ask people, are you a Christian nationalist? Right. So they've defined these criteria, and particularly PRI has mastered this, I think, above all, with these diagnostic questions that they monitor, which is what you're talking about. And I think you're a very interesting way of getting at it. But the other thing that historically has been noted that I think most people don't hear enough is the whole notion of nationalism is on the rise globally, right. Not just white Christian. Our version right now is white Christian nationalism, but how does this fit into the larger global picture where there's a rising nationalism?
Yeah, I think nationalism, or this blind allegiance to authority that requires preeminence over all other allegiances, and that often involves an ethno-national identity that sometimes includes a kind of religious identity as well, that we see that happening all over the world right now, in many different places and from many different religious perspectives. And so I do think it's important to ground what's happening in the United States in that context. The Christian in Christian nationalism is much more about an ethno-national identity and an identity in the American context of whiteness than it is about a given theological or religious perspective. But what's important about the Christian part of Christian nationalism is it uses the symbols and the language of Christianity. It gives a kind of permission structure to the violence and to the authoritarianism that is still quite popular and has a lot of cultural currency in the American society, right? Yes. Because Christianity does continue to be the majority religion. There is a lot of civil religion in the United States, everything from God Bless America to One Nation Under God, all of these kind of, I think quite, cheap references to the divine in ways that kind of co-opt religion and religious language into patriotic language. So there's a lot to tap into in the national consciousness that people want to be associated in some way with the majority, with Christianity. But I think you're right to point out that the driving factor here is not so much the Christianity, but it's the nationalism. And it's using Christianity as a prop to achieve that ultimate goal, which is power and authoritarianism at that. And it's all very anti-democratic. But from a Christian perspective, it's also incredibly theologically problematic, and it harms an authentic Christian witness.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I'm thinking of it in terms that Christianity is the cracker and nationalism is the jam that you're spreading on top of it to get it in, right? Mm-hmm. This becomes the vehicle for this with us. So one of the things I see, and I'm sure you run into this as well, some of my, friends who are more conservative, and certainly people I follow on social media who are more conservative, Like I just saw a post last week where someone posted some prayer somewhere. What it was didn't matter. And they said, well, is this Christian nationalism? And others say, well, they're going to accuse us of being Christian nationalists. And so there's this, apart from Marjorie Taylor Greene, there are other people who know that this is a bad thing, but they feel like they're being labeled wrongly, whether they are or not. And I'm wondering how much you see this confusion or this attempt to say, okay, what really is this? And am I a Christian nationalist?
Yeah. I think you're really getting at a very real human emotion and instinct to, one, not to be labeled, but also not to be ostracized or, called out. And if we're something that, yes, you're right, the majority of people, when they hear Christian nationalism or Christian nationalists, don't want to be openly associated with it.
Yeah.
But I think that, and that's why I always talk about Christian nationalism as a political ideology and a cultural framework. I think it really is, in many ways, akin to racism, both in the content, right? We're talking about white Christian nationalism and all the overlaps that Christian nationalism has with white supremacy and whiteness, but also in the way that it's just present in American society,
Yeah.
right? And so just like it's not very helpful or accurate to label certain people as racist and certain people not racist, I think it is in the same way not a helpful way to go around labeling some people as Christian nationalists and not. And the public polling really supports this way of talking about it because as Samuel Perry says, the sociologist of religion who wrote one of the first books, I heard him first say, Christian nationalism is not a diagnosis. It's not something that you either have or you don't have, but it's an orientation. It's something that we can either embrace or reject. And we actually have opportunities on a daily basis to do just that. Just like racism, right? Racism is just present in our culture. And we have opportunities all the time to embrace or reject it. It's also, of course, a structural problem. In many ways, Christian nationalism is also a structural problem. But as an ideology, it's something that's present and that we have to do our own work to understand where have we internalized some of the messages of Christian nationalism in ways that we've never really fully faced or come to terms with. And so the way that I write about it in the book, and also encourage others who want to have conversations with people, is don't call certain people Christian nationalists. Even, maybe you noticed when I was talking about Speaker Mike Johnson, I say he's somebody who's embracing Christian nationalism.
Okay.
It also, I think from a religious or spiritual or Christian perspective, we always, have hope that people have the opportunity to change, including ourselves. Right. So there's something about labeling someone that makes it feel like an immutable characteristic. And Christian nationalism is not like that. It's something we actually have quite a bit of power and control over if we are willing to have the hard conversations, including the hard conversations with ourselves, right? The internal interrogation about how we might have adopted some of these ideas and ways of thinking without even recognizing it.
I think that's an excellent point. So if I'm imagining a Venn diagram in which we're trying to show the relation of Christian nationalism to other things in the United States. And there are all these things I can think of, like Project 2025. You talk about racism. There's some ageism in this. There's some religion in this. What would be the big intersecting pieces of Christian nationalism, including those that I just mentioned?
Yeah, I think, okay, so I'm going to change your image a little bit.
Sure.
When I think, instead of a Venn diagram, I kind of sometimes think of Christian nationalism as just the soil that a lot of this is growing out of,
okay.
right? Or
okay.
it's a root cause that is just present in society in ways that allow some of these other unjust things to spring out of. Now, I'll say Project 2025 is kind of its own thing that I would associate more with the movement side of Christian nationalism, a very intentional way of people in power trying to hold on to that power and impose their own interpretation of the Bible and theological views on everyone else, right? In ways that really lead to a lot of inequality and inequity in our society. So, I mean, putting aside that, but when I think about all of the different ways that, racism, for instance, the income inequality and ways that that has kind of sprung out of, it's all kind of, I think also another helpful idea is to think about the United States in many ways as a caste system. And Christian nationalism has created, white, largely Protestant Christian men at the top of the caste system, right? And everybody else is in some ways a second-class citizen because they don't fit into that narrow view of what constitutes an American. This is this, idea of America as a Christian nation, but with that is a lot of coded language that includes patriarchy, racism, xenophobia, militarism, that a lot of those other problems kind of spring out of this base idea of Christian nationalism.
Yeah, I like that image. That's really, really helpful. For those who are joining us on Facebook Live or here, just to remind everyone what we're talking about, I'm visiting with Amanda Tyler, who's the Executive Director of Baptist Joint Committee, BGC, and she's the author of a new book that's not out yet, but you can pre-order it everywhere fine books are sold. It's called How to End Christian Nationalism. And that's a good turning point in our conversation to say, we've done some diagnosis of this, we've done some description of this, but the bulk of the book goes into 8 ways anybody can work to end Christian nationalism. So it's very proactive in that regard. And maybe you just want to preview what those 8 steps are, and then let's talk about some of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I organize the book, the chapters are actually labeled as steps. And so this is answering a question that I have actually received quite a bit of as I've been out speaking about Christian nationalism over the last 5 years. Well, what can I do? And I think the problem is a problem as large as Christian nationalism, something that has been around for centuries. It can feel too huge for just one person or one faith community to take on. And I get that. And so I think part of what I'm trying to do through the book is to say, we each have a role to play, and here are ways that you can get started on that journey. So, the first step is just to name and understand the threat of Christian nationalism. This idea that if we don't have language around what we're talking about, we're not really able to address the problem. And that's a lot of what we've been talking about so far here, Mark, is just giving some language and some understanding around it. And in this step, I really draw on a lot of the excellent research and writing that has already been done on this topic, and try to kind of put that all together into, relatively short chapters so that people can get on their way on the next steps. The step 2 is to ground ourselves in God's love, to really understand. Again, my primary audience for this book, anyone can buy it. I think it can be helpful in any community, but when you're writing, you really need a primary audience in mind. My primary audience are Christians who are wanting to do something about Christian nationalism, and even more specifically to white Christians. And so, but this book, this step is really calling on Christians to remember the core of our faith tradition, which I believe is a gospel of love, and the central commandments of Jesus, and to understand how Christian nationalism is at odds with that gospel of love, and to really kind of get back in touch with the core of our faith commitments. And that's really a huge danger of Christian nationalism, is it, I believe, is a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus and causes us to worship power over worshiping in God and loving God and serving our neighbors and loving our neighbors.
So let me pause on that one. I want to slow down just a moment because I think it's such an excellent point. and we've got story after story after story on our site that have been written about this lack of love. And we saw this illustrated during the COVID pandemic with people like John MacArthur and others who refused to love their neighbor by closing down. It was all about me and my need to worship. And we got court cases out of that and all of that. But there is, it seems to me, a pervasive denial of the loving message of the Gospels that is fueling not just this, but so much of the discontent in American Christianity. I'm wondering how you see that intersection.
Yeah, well, I find it so telling that those who are most embracing Christian nationalism very rarely ever quote the Gospels or point to the life of Jesus. They are often cherry picking other quotes out of the Bible, and I think really misinterpreting or twisting them in order to justify their own power play, their own unequal and ways of being, their own use of violence, right? And so I thought it was just really important, both for Christians, but also for others who are getting a very warped sense of what Christianity is through the lens of Christian nationalism, to kind of explain what Christianity is all about, and to encourage Christians to kind of rediscover in some ways the heart of that gospel message so that they can be, I think, better messengers of that love, both with their words, but more importantly, with their deeds in our communities. And so I think that if we're really going to do the hard work of dismantling Christian nationalism as Christians, we have to work on being better Christians to begin with.
So that's a theological problem. It manifests as a political problem or a social problem, but at its root, it's a misunderstanding of the Gospels, it's a misunderstanding of the Bible. And one of the things that is so frustrating when we hear pastors say, well, I can't be political, I can't address politics from the pulpit or whatever. Fine, you can still preach the Gospels and the gospel, which is the gospel of love. And, as Russell Moore famously documented in his book, sadly, today, you can stand up and read the Sermon on the Mount and someone's going to accuse you of being political because of the way it's received. And that's the soil we're living in right now.
Yeah. And, I would argue that the gospel is inherently political because Jesus was always concerned about the welfare of the people who lived in his community. If that's what I believe that's what politics is caring for our neighbors and being concerned about everyone's welfare. And so it doesn't have to be partisan. Right? We don't have to be partisan when we're preaching the gospel, but we are about caring and making our community a more loving, inclusive, and protective place for those who live here. So I think that preaching the gospel is something that is really essential in all things, but is particularly essential if we're going to push back against Christian nationalism.
So I interrupted the countdown. By 8-step plan, I think we're two.
We're two in, yeah.
Okay, what's the third one?
Denouncing violence. And I think part of this chapter is really trying to draw awareness to the ways that Christian nationalism is inspiring violence and uses violent ends uses violent means for its ends of grabbing and holding on to power, but also to, again, theologically remind readers about how such violence is directly at odds with an authentic Christian witness.
Yeah.
Step 4 is asking people to commit to the separation of church and state. And this is really, I think, an important kind of myth-busting chapter because there's so much misinformation that's being put out there about what separation of church and state means, about the founding documents of the United States, including the U.S. Constitution, and really wanting people to have some easy to understand ways to defend the separation of church and state, to understand how it's a protection for religious freedom, and to understand how Christian nationalism undercuts those values of religious freedom. So this chapter comes out of most directly probably the work of Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty.
That's your bread and butter right there.
Yeah, exactly. And my training as an attorney comes out here. That's my background. And so I get so frustrated when I hear how the separation of church and state is maligned and misunderstood. And I really wanted to set the record straight and help others do the same when they hear untruths, misinformation, myths out there about this concept.
Yeah, maybe this is a good point to pause, and I'll give my commercial here, and you can either endorse it or not endorse it. That so much of what we're writing about in recent years is the putting all the gas, all the emphasis on the free exercise clause of the First Amendment and ignoring the Establishment Clause.
Right.
We have these conservative evangelicals who want to be free to do whatever they want to do, even if it establishes their religion over others, but they don't want others to have the same right to do that. And that's not really religious freedom. It's selective, right?
Exactly. And how misused even the words religious freedom have become, and really helping explain and hopefully for people to find some element of patriotism in defending the separation of church and state, understanding how that is part of what it means to be an American, how that is part of support for a pluralistic democracy. Yes, I think that's a very important education piece of the book, and ways that people, again, can use that in conversation and myth busting, including on places like social media, to set the record straight.
Yeah, so this is a good point to remind everyone. Amanda, we were talking about this earlier. This book is ideal for small groups. It'd be great for your adult Sunday school class, for your book study, for your neighborhood group, your men's group, your women's group, your whatever group. Because it's very easily divided into units, and you can study that and discuss it either as a whole or in individual chapters. So you could get 8 or 10 weeks of a study out of this, depending on how you chose to craft it. You could do it faster too if you wanted to, but each one of those units really is fascinating. This chapter, I just have to say, if there's anything we need right now as bedrock, it's this understanding what religious liberty really is and what it is not.
Yeah. And each chapter or step ends with reading from the Bible. I'm a Baptist after all.
Okay.
I gotta get my Bible in there. So I have scripture readings at the end and reflection questions for each step as well. Yeah. And then step 5 is probably the most common question I get, is just like, how do I talk to my friends and family about this? How do I take this on in my church community? And so I'm not going to oversell. I don't think there's if somebody has a magic answer to that question, then I want to hear what your answer is, because I think sometimes it's most difficult to talk about this with people that we love. And at the same time, those are the people that we actually have a relationship with. And if we're going to move the needle, then we need to be having those conversations. And so step 5 is take on Christian nationalism close to home. Again, I'm drawing on other experts throughout the book. And in this chapter in particular, Dr. Pamela Cooper-Wright has written a book on the psychology of Christian nationalism. I talk about some of her tips on how to do this and best ways to approach this really difficult topic, including understanding that we don't do well if we approach trying to change someone's mind, but rather if we can come in with a spirit of genuine love, curiosity, and seeking understanding about what might be driving this, that's probably the best way. Again, these are conversations that are best done in real life, not through social media posts. Right. I think that can be a common impulse, is wanting to just meme our way out of a problem, and that's really not going to make much progress here. So really encouraging people to take it on. But also, and this has been a central part of the campaign, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, how is this impacting our church communities? How have our worship practices, our theologies, our ways of reading the Bible and preaching, how has that been impacted by Christian nationalism? So I talk some about with some pastors and give some examples of how pastors are doing this in their churches, which I hope is an encouragement to lay leaders as well as clergy who are reading the book. Yep. Yeah, and then I'll just do 6, 7, and 8 all together because I think they really do go together. That this idea of once we've kind of, done our own work, we've done some education, we've worked in our close communities, and really some of these are being all done at the same time. That we're ready to do more outward advocacy around the topic, and so some of that is done in areas of community organizing, of getting involved in multi-faith, multiracial, multi-ethnic campaigns and organizing coalitions that might be doing work in our communities, that we can better understand how Christian nationalism is impacting us close to home, and then work together in these communities that I think really mirror God's wish for God's world, that we would be working across all kinds of lines of difference and diversity in loving communities to make our world a better place. That's the kind of organizing that we really need to do around this problem. And at the same time, we need to be advocating for change with our local lawmakers and other leaders. And so encouraging people to do that both generally and giving them examples of how to do it, but also using a very particular case study of how do we protect religious freedom in public schools? Because I see of all the areas of society, I think there is in some ways the most concerted push to push Christian nationalism in public schools right now. And we are all impacted by public schools, whether or not we were a product of public schools, as I was, or if we have kids in public schools. We pay taxes in our communities that support our public schools. And still around 90% of America's children are educated in public schools. This is our future. So we should all care about how religious freedom is protected in public schools. And so I kind of go through some of the current threats, although I'll admit there have been even more threats since I finished writing this book, right? But some of the current threats and some of the efforts we've seen, and then strategies on how to use our voice in the public square to push back against it.
Let me just say to those who are online right now, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. We've got a couple loaded. I'm going to get to them in just a moment. We're going to take the last 15 minutes or so of our time to address questions that you want to ask Amanda out of this. So before we get to the questions, I do find the book not as depressing as others, because you do lead us to some hope out of that. And I'm one of those people who's despondent most of the time. How in the world has this happened? How have we gotten to this place? And it's hard to imagine. It's once you're in that pit, it's hard to imagine a different world that we're ever going to escape this. But you seem a little more optimistic than the Debbie Downers like me.
Well, part of that is just maybe my orientation. Like I'm a glass half full type of person to begin with. But I've also been buoyed and encouraged by the response we've had to the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign over the last 5 years, that people seem hungry to get involved. People know the problems. They're horrified to be associated with Christian nationalism as Christians, and horrified to see their faith used in that way, and really motivated to do something about it. And so just the fact that there is an audience for this book, right? That's encouraging to me.
Right.
Also, just the numbers, and I go through some of the polling and numbers here, but I want to encourage people that actually there are more of us who are concerned and pushing back against Christian nationalism than there are people who are fully bought in and wanting to impose it on everyone else. And so, but what we need to do, and what the book is really encouraging people to do, is we need to normalize speaking out against Christian nationalism, and also encourage each other to get more directly involved in our pluralistic democracy. And so I think there has been a sense, particularly among white Americans, of complacency over the last several, over my lifetime, over the last several decades. I think there was a different kind of period of activism in the 1960s, certainly. But, since then, people have kind of not been as actively engaged for the most part. And this is a moment where we need more active engagement if we're going to save democracy. And for Christians, I think we have a calling to be involved in the affairs of our communities and in the affairs of our world. That is God's wish for us is, we pray in the Lord's Prayer, God's kingdom come, right, to earth as it is in heaven. And that is our work, is to work to make, I believe, our world a more just place. And so that work that we are about, I think, can be very much channeled into this present moment that we have now, where we do see an urgent threat to democracy and to Christian witness in the form of Christian nationalism. So I'm wide-eyed about the problem. I'm encouraged by people's interest in getting involved, and I want to give them a sense of hope and encouragement in the work that we have to do. And I personally, having been, I moved to Texas from Washington, D.C. a little over a year ago, and I sadly have a lot more opportunities to get directly involved in the struggle against Christian nationalism in Texas than I did in Washington, D.C. But I have found tremendous hope and encouragement from the level of resistance that I'm feeling among my neighbors who are saying, this state government does not represent me. This doesn't represent the kind of community that I want to live in, and I'm willing to do something about it. And I think that can feel very energizing, and I want more people to be involved in that movement.
Well, you made just a reminder. You made an excellent point earlier on that those who would advocate for Christian nationalism and its ancillary ideas are a vast minority.
That's right.
But they've got a huge megaphone right now that's funded by certain people. I think of them like, that annoying person who's in the car driving around with the loudspeaker mounted on top, just shouting out their ideas. They're not popular ideas, but they're very loud, and people keep hearing them and seeing them.
Not only are they loud, but in places like Texas, they actually hold the power, and so they're able, and some of that is linked directly to money, right? And there's a new article out that was just in the New York Times Magazine this week. I spoke at length with the reporter for that piece, Ava Kaufman, that talks about two billionaires that are basically funding a push for authoritarian theocracy in Texas, and how Christian nationalism is motivating them. But because of their power, influence, and money, that their ideas are being pushed on everyone else in Texas. Ideas that are a minority position, even in a place like Texas. Some people listening in from around the country might not know that. They might just assume because of the policies that people in Texas agree with them, and that's just not the case.
Yeah. So we've got some questions I want to get to. First of all, one of the questions is, will this be available to show others? And the answer is yes. We will have this posted within about 24, 48 hours on our website, on our YouTube channel. It's also on Facebook Live right now if you want to capture it to share before we get the cleaned up version out there. Okay, question. What part does capitalism and the imaginary hand philosophy play in Christian nationalism? There's your economic question.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I keep going back to the word power, right? And I think about capitalism, and particularly kind of how it's manifesting with vast wealth inequality in our society today. Again, global issue of religious nationalism for most of our conversation today, and the focus of the book, I am kind of zeroing in on the American experience, the U.S. experience, but seeing, even when I was just talking about the billionaires in Texas, because of hoarding of wealth at the top, they're able to have an outsized influence on politics that is able to impose their ideas on everyone else. And there's a level of free market, but then at what point the free market economics actually lead to an undercutting of democratic principles? And how are we, if we're not able to live freely, if people aren't able to afford food or a place to live, to have a sustainable way of life, that's not freedom either. And so I think the ways that capitalism has been propped up, and this also, of course, you can't have conversations about this without talking about racism, Mark, and how our whole system was founded on slave labor, right? And how the capitalistic drive led to the dehumanization of our human siblings, right? And the way that has driven the American experience, understanding that. And then also, this is where I'll bring Christian nationalism back into it, how those policies were justified by a misreading of the Bible, right? How our Christian scriptures were used to justify the doctrine of discovery that first led to the stealing of lands from Native peoples, and also used to justify slavery, to justify Jim Crow segregation and lynching, throughout the centuries. Racism, Christian nationalism, and capitalism, I believe, have been inextricably linked. And so I think, again, I'm not trying to take on everything in this one small book, but I think if we better understand Christian nationalism, we can better understand the roots of a lot of these other inequalities and injustices.
So there's another question that I think adds a missing element to that recipe you just said, and that is, what part does American exceptionalism play in this? Yeah,
great question. And I think we think about American exceptionalism in a lot of different ways. One way I often think about it is that is this idea of God's providential hand guiding America, through history, and that God has a special role to play in God's, overall plan for the world. Another kind of intersecting ideology, I think, is like manifest destiny, or the use again of some kind of spiritual or biblical or scriptural basis for taking land, that European Christians and by extension white Americans have some kind of special role that is exceptional and better than others. And in this way, Christian nationalism is not just, again, an attack on equality, but it's also, from a theological point of view, a perversion of the gospel. Yes. And, I often say, John's gospel tells us, for God so loved the world. It doesn't say for God so loved the United States. But the doctrine of American exceptionalism, the doctrine of Christian nationalism tells a different story, right? It suggests that God does love the United States more than God loves other places on earth, and that there's some special nature of American democracy. We see it also manifested in things like the founding documents are divinely inspired. These are all kind of pieces of this overall, I think, fabric of overlapping ideologies.
I heard Tim Alberta speak at Baylor a few weeks ago, and in answer to a question about Christian nationalism, he said his definition of Christian nationalism is bad history mixed with bad theology. Yeah. That it takes both. You've got to misread history and you got to misread theology, and that's a toxic mix together. Yeah, I think that's well put, and often, and this goes with the American exceptionalism as well, the history of America as a quote unquote Christian nation is a cherry picked history. Right. It's one that uses selective founders' biographies combined with taken out of context quotes to create a story that actually doesn't match an honest reading of history or the constitutional text itself. Yep. And that's the bad history that comes into play. Okay, we got one last question in
Sure.
here. I'm just going to read it. Taking civil rights and voting rights as an example, we have seen these movements erode rather quickly over the past few years. How would you recommend grounding ourselves in this movement in such a way that it becomes part of our ethos rather than thinking we simply need to do something that doesn't need to be sustained?
Good question. I mean, part of what I try to talk about in the book is to understand, for people to really understand how long of a problem this has been, right? I think something that is sometimes missing in the conversations around Christian nationalism is when Christian nationalism is linked almost exclusively with Trumpism, or something that is just kind of newly come onto the scene, when in fact, this is just our current manifestation of a very old and a very long problem. And so in the book, I talk about, I prepare people for the fact that this is going to take multiple generations to actually do the work. Okay, sorry, spoiler alert, but you're not going to end Christian nationalism by reading this book, or any book for that matter. But you've got to kind of join a long-standing movement to do the work. And so I think really kind of being realistic with ourselves about how long and deeply seated this problem is will help prepare us for the long and difficult journey that it will take to dismantle it. But with any movement, we've got to be willing to both appreciate, recognize, and celebrate the small wins that come along the way, right? Yeah. And I'll give you an example of one of those wins that's not in the book, because it's something that has happened recently. And there's this current curriculum in Texas before the State Board of Education that I think is an excellent, awful, but a textbook example of Christian nationalism, of trying to teach the Bible to kids as young as kindergarten as fact in public schools, in ways that interfere with everyone's religious freedom. And our campaign, along with a number of other groups in Texas, helped train people to go and testify against this harmful curriculum before the State Board of Education last month in Austin. And it was a beautiful thing. It was a beautiful thing to outnumber 3-1 the people who were there to testify in favor of the curriculum, for people from all faiths and no faiths coming together to say, this is an attack on my religious freedom. And, the State Board of Education hasn't even voted on that yet, right? We don't even know yet whether it's going to, but I take that as a win, that everyday people were willing to take a whole day out of their busy week to go to Austin, to take a risk and speak in front of, at times, a very hostile State Board of Education, and willing to speak up for their neighbors. And so I think if we can kind of take stock and understand that part of how we're ending Christian nationalism is not just what bad ideas do we defeat, but what communities are we building along the way? And how are we better, as Christians, how are we better showing God's love for our neighbors, that will help sustain us for what will be a very long road ahead.
Okay, well, we're at the end of our hour, and this has been a great conversation. I will point out for those of you who are watching, if you look right over Amanda's right shoulder on that bookshelf, there's a red that is the book. I don't have a physical copy because it's not out yet. I have a digital copy that I read in preparation for this, but that's what it looks like. It's red. Go find it on Amazon, go find it on Barnes & Noble, go find it at your favorite bookstore site, wherever you want, and join the throngs of people who are pre-ordering and get it there. Amanda, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your work. It's been a real pleasure to visit with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.
Support independent faith-based journalism. Baptist News Global.